On a cold, dark London evening, a man hauls a heavy bag into the back of a cab. Hours later, he discards it in a canal. It's been a struggle, despite his best efforts, to lighten the load.
A human body, is a very unwieldy, heavy, difficult object. And if you can cut it down into pieces, they become more manageable.
The next day, a 29-year-old star of BBC soap series EastEnders is reported missing. At first, few fear the worst.
People go missing all the time, and we have to remember that adults are entitled to go missing if they want to.
Sometime later, a shocking sight confronts a group using a canal for leisure boating.
Gemma's skull was found about half a mile upstream of where her torso had been recovered. And they identified this plastic bag and opened it up, and to their horror, there was this head, her skull inside.
Murdered, her body had been dismembered and thrown into the water. Who had killed Gemma McCluskey, and what part had her brother Tony played in her disappearance and death?
Tony and Gemma are known to have a difficult relationship. Gemma's told friends that he can be controlling, he can be abusive. She's told her father that he can be aggressive and abusive.
Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the puzzle will reveal Tony McCluskey as guilty of murder? What would be the killer's mistake? The dead can tell a story if you know how to listen. Dame Sue Black understands the language spoken by all that remains of a body. She knows what should and should not be there, like bruises, cuts, holes, crushed bones. She is a forensic anthropologist.
Forensic anthropology comes from two words. The forensic bit is Latin, which means pertaining to the court, and the anthropology bit just means the study of man. So if you were to put them together, it's the study of man for the purposes of the court, but the reality is that it's about identification. So who is the individual, who was the individual, and can we assist the investigative authorities, whether that's police or otherwise, to determine what might have happened to that individual.
Individuals like Gemma McCluskey. Her father spoke outside court after an exhaustive 10-month police investigation which uncovered scarcely believable events.
Good night, God bless Gemma. We all miss you and love you. Thank you.
So in effect, two of the children that Tony Senior has are no longer part of his life. And that really was, I think, significant.
It would be a grisly murder for the police to solve, one featuring tales of abduction, false trails and subterfuge.
No one can imagine quite how horrific it must have been to have been told that Gemma had been murdered and that her body had been dismembered, only later to be told that her brother was suspected of being the person who was responsible.
The fact that your daughter is dead is one thing. The fact that she gets murdered is another, but to be murdered and dismembered by your own son or by your brother, it was just an awful time for them. And it is, that part of the investigation kind of still sits with me and many of the team in terms of, the impact that had on the family and Gemma's close friends, because she did have an awful lot of very close friends.
How had police got their man? So-called sororicide, when a brother kills a sister, is very rare. Tony McCluskey had seemed deeply concerned when he first presented at a London police station in the search for the then missing Gemma McCluskey.
he became very involved in the search for Gemma, and because she had been on television in a very famous soap opera, so there was public interest in what had potentially happened to her, and he had put himself really right at the centre of that search for her.
McCluskey himself is the kind of poster child for his poor missing sister. He's pictured in the Sun newspaper holding a missing persons poster.
It was a charade. One evening, Tony McCluskey, not for the first time, had become violent towards Gemma.
It was devastating violence, and it was violence that was always going to end with Gemma's death.
He had grabbed something heavy, smashed it into Gemma's head.
She died as a result of blunt force trauma. How that happened, we don't know.
He says that he doesn't remember what happens, that the last thing he remembers is Gemma coming at him with a knife, and then he can't remember anything after that.
To hide his crime, he decided on a grotesque plan of action, to cut her body into disposable parts.
And suddenly you're faced with a body and you have the panic that says, how do I get rid of it? The vast majority of dismemberments are solely practical for the means of getting the body either out of the environment in which the murder has occurred or to conceal it in small parts within the area where that murder's occurred.
How would the real-life story of the death of a soap star be uncovered? Sue Black's remarkable expertise in forensic anthropology would be vital in revealing the mistake made by Gemma McCluskey's killer. The mystery began when Gemma was first reported missing by her two brothers, one of whom, Tony, walked into a police station on March the 1st, 2012. At first, detectives were not unduly concerned.
The first thing that the police will do whenever there's a missing person report is a kind of a mini victimology. So was Gemma vulnerable in any way? Not really, no. Were her brothers raising any concerns that they think something serious had happened to her? They may not have been at that point. They certainly said something that they had concerns about her boyfriend, but from the police perspective, there were no real vulnerabilities there and no concerns raised, and perhaps she just was staying with a boyfriend.
One day became two. Police and her brothers speculated that she may have gone somewhere, perhaps with a boyfriend.
There was nothing being said that raised any red flags that something might have happened to Gemma. So it may well have been that they were told, well, let's see, try phoning her, let's try calling her, go and speak to her friends, and we'll see what happens over the next 24 hours.
Gemma did not appear in the next 24 hours. Her brother, Tony, led a group of over 100 volunteers who leafleted East and South London, looking for leads into Gemma's disappearance, with one hand mysteriously bandaged.
He was obviously very convincing. He was able to convince his brother that he didn't know what happened to Gemma, and he was able to convince the police, so quite possibly he was presenting as quite calm.
Soon to be called into the case, Met Detective John Nicholson.
So Tony was trying to kind of manage the information as it was coming out. He wanted to be the person that was managing that. So at one stage, he was informed that the neighbour had heard Gemma crying. And it was the neighbour's daughter who said to him, "Oh, but what should I do, Tony? Shall I tell the police?" And he said, "Oh, no, leave that with me. I need to speak to your mum first." So, of course, Tony never reported that to the police.
And that would have given him a feeling of having some control over where the search went, over who was a suspect or who wasn't. And he's the kind of person that needs that kind of control. So it doesn't surprise me that he was right in the centre of everything that was going on.
He'd also found out the local community were, they'd put all these leaflets out, people were ringing in. He'd found out, somebody had said that they thought they'd seen Gemma on the Friday at the local kebab shop. So, of course, Tony was happy to pick the phone up to the missing persons inquiry police officer to say, you know, this is what's happened, you want to get yourself up there. So in terms of trying to manage and steer the investigation, he was doing what he could to, on the face of it, be helpful, but actually not be helpful at all.
On day 5 of the search, Tony contacted police with a chilling message. Someone had tracked him down and ordered him to pay a ransom for the safe return of Gemma.
And it would have diverted police attention, and because of Gemma having been on the television, it was credible that perhaps that had happened to her.
Had Gemma been abducted? If so, why wait 5 days to demand a ransom? Something else was concerning detectives. They were hearing dark mutterings about Tony McCluskey.
So what we discovered was that there was sibling rivalry.
Too soon to reach a conclusion, but with no sign of Gemma by day 6 of the search, detectives were deeply concerned. Where is Gemma McCluskey? In Dundee, where Dame Sue Black was then based, the search for Gemma McCluskey was not on her agenda.
Like everybody else, you watch the news, and there was an item about a missing person who had been an actress on a soap opera, and that everybody had been out looking for her, including her brother and her family. But that's the level of involvement and knowledge that I had, just the same as the general public.
That was about to change. It was a cold, late winter day when a group of pleasure boaters who use this stretch of the Regent's Canal basin in northeast London came across a suitcase floating in the water. On colliding with the boat, it sprang open to reveal nauseating contents. There appeared to be a dismembered female body inside.
So I received a phone call from the Metropolitan Police back in March of 2012. And at that point, they had recovered a torso from Regent's Canal that had been encased within a suitcase. And then they had gone back and they had dredged the canal and they had found her limbs as well. At that point, we didn't find her head.
Sue Black was able to tell us with accuracy how many cuts had been made.
It was March 7th. The forensic anthropologist was not needed to identify whose body parts had been found.
We knew it was Gemma. Her torso had a very characteristic tattoo at the base of her spine, and they had taken the DNA sample and they'd been able to compare it with Gemma's DNA. So they knew by that point it was her.
Once Gemma's torso has been found and identified by the tattoo on her body, police are now treating this as a murder inquiry.
Now it was about finding out who in fact was the perpetrator.
Investigations follow the evidence. Detective John Nicholson now needed to find out how Gemma had been killed. The body parts were first examined by a local pathologist. At that early stage of the inquiry, he could not determine how the victim had died.
And he couldn't make his assessment until all the parts of Gemma's body had been recovered. Initially, within the first 2 weeks, Gemma's limbs, her 2 arms and her 2 legs, are recovered within the same body of water but further downstream. But we'd never managed to find Gemma's skull. And without that, all the pathologists could say, he could rule out certain things. For example, he could say it wasn't a gunshot wound. But until we recovered Gemma's head, he wasn't able to say how she had died.
If not how, then when, where, with what, why, and most importantly, to reveal the picture of a killer, who. Gemma's killer clearly had tried to cover his tracks by dismembering her body. Detectives believed that the decision to cut up the body of Gemma McCluskey would reveal some of the answers that they were looking for. It's where Sue Black comes in, interest in the subject pricked in her childhood.
Every Saturday, every weekend, I spent in a butcher shop, cutting up meat, rolling meat, understanding bones.
She knows all about dismemberment, not a subject just anyone can cope with, but an area of expertise for which she has become world-renowned.
And when I got to university, I studied biology. And in third year, I went into anatomy. And it's a relatively straightforward step from the butcher shop into the anatomy, so that you see the relationship between human and animal.
Crucial facts or probabilities began to emerge as Sue Black considered the evidence in front of her, the body of Gemma McCluskey. First, the very action of cutting a body limb from limb reveals something which is not as obvious as it seems.
A murder has usually occurred before you have dismemberment.
So much more emerges, roughly where the murder has taken place.
Normally, in dismemberments, the victim and the suspect know each other. And so it normally occurs in the property associated with one or either individual. It would be extremely rare for a dismemberment to be stranger-oriented. Most of them are because there's been some form of personal conflict between the two individuals.
People have described their relationship almost as if her brother was her boyfriend, because he behaved in a very possessive and jealous way. He kind of took ownership of her, and he tried to control everything that she did, which is classic domestic abuse, classic coercive control. And he was certainly taking the part of a controlling partner.
The psychology of cutting a human limb from limb includes overcoming a challenge few would ever consider they would one day face. As the killer cuts the body, a decision has to be made, to face her or not. This too struck Sue Black.
That was a question asked of me in court. Was she facing upwards or facing downwards when he took her head off? Because there's some really quite emotive psychology within that, in terms of looking at the face of your sister whilst you remove her head.
Through forensic examination of the impact of cutting bone, Sue Black was able to discover the answer, to tell the jury of the gruesome ritual which had followed Gemma's murder.
She was lying on her back when he started the dismemberment. So when he was working on her right leg, then she was facing upwards, and he really didn't succeed, so he turned her over. And so for the rest of her dismemberment, she was face down.
That fact established more evidence. Those who do not know their victim are more likely to keep the body facing upwards. Those who do know them turn their bodies to lie on the front so their eyes cannot be seen. Gemma's killer knew her. Of that, detectives could now be confident. A murder story then of people who know each other well and probably in a property one or other lived or worked in. The body also helps tell why a murder has happened. Analysing dismemberment reveals the nature of the attack sudden, spontaneous, perhaps after a row.
The most common form of dismemberment is that which occurs as a result of the fact that the individual had not planned it. So there was no planning of the murder.
The picture of a murderer was building. Gemma's killer had snapped. He knew her, and they were in a building or room one or other owned or worked in. So much revealed by the dismemberment analysis, including an indication of where the body parts would be discarded.
There's been a lot of research in terms of dismemberment, looking at what are the common patterns, what is the common means of disposal, where are they going to go. Most body parts end up in a body of water somewhere. So they end up in canals or rivers or lakes or dropped off at the sea or wherever it may be. We have a tendency to drop into water more frequently than we have to try and bury.
Analysis can also say if the act was done by an amateur or an expert.
So we were involved in a case in London where the dismemberment was done with such incredible skill that we felt this individual had prior experience. So whether they were a surgeon or a butcher or a gamekeeper or something in that sort of line, the body, rather than being cut in an amateur way, was actually jointed more than dismembered. So we can tell the difference when somebody is a real amateur at cutting a body into pieces or whether they have some experience.
Whoever had killed Gemma had no experience, and it showed.
So we were able to advise the police that the first cut started on her right leg. And the cuts that were made there, he started using a normal kitchen knife. It didn't work. There were 56 cuts associated with trying to cut through the bone inside her thigh.
The dismemberment analysis was yielding results.
So we were able to say to the police that this individual who had undertaken the dismemberment was an amateur. They had not done it before.
The type of location such a crime has happened can also be gleaned. If a garden implement is used to cut the body, it's likely to be a suburb or the countryside. If not, then probably a kitchen or a bathroom, which indicates a flat or something similar in a built-up area.
There is a real pattern of what's available to people within their domiciles that we can predict to a greater or lesser extent.
Detectives set about finding and proving a case against the killer. 6 months after her arms, legs and torso had been found, more evidence. Another suitcase discovered by those using the canal, this time containing Gemma's head.
Her head was identified through dental records, so clearly it was Gemma. And the pathologist said that she had died as a result of blunt force trauma to the head.
We said it was most likely to have occurred in her property, most likely in a bathroom area, most likely with an implement that would have been taken from the kitchen as a sharp knife, but that there was in fact a heavier blade. There was no garden associated with this flat, so it's unlikely there was a garden shed. It would have been something within the kitchen.
She had 2, perhaps 3 fractures of the skull, and that those fractures had taken place while she was alive because there was still blood staining on the skull itself. So he was able to give that. He could dismiss strangulation. She died as a result of blunt force trauma.
So Gemma had been hit with great strength, indicating a man. She had been known by her attacker and killed in a place familiar to one or both of them. He was probably a stranger to this sort of crime, in a property without a garden, like a flat. He lived not far from water, the likely place to dispatch her remains. He had snapped after some sort of incident, and almost certainly, Gemma knew her killer.
At the point where the police are concerned, they will always be looking to the people closest first, and they will be looking at the behaviours of people around very, very closely, especially as when a woman is killed, it is more than likely somebody very close to her that has done it.
A missing person inquiry had become a murder investigation, and the evidence was closing in on the killer of Gemma McCluskey. Police knew that whoever had killed Gemma had done so spontaneously. He probably had a violent temper and was somebody close to her. Stories were now reaching detectives suggesting a troubled relationship between Gemma and her brother Tony, with whom she lived in Pelter Street, Hackney, in London.
They had done their background checks on Tony, and they knew that he and Gemma had a volatile relationship and that he was a bully.
And I think from a very early stage, they had their suspicions about Tony McCluskey, and it fitted within the pattern that there had been conflict between brother and sister.
They both had very different personalities. Gemma was very outgoing, she was very socially skilled, she liked her friends, she liked going out, she had a good social life, and she had a very good career as well. In complete contrast, her brother was very much described as a loner, somebody who didn't really have many social skills. He liked to spend a lot of time on his own, and he kind of fixated on his relationship with her as the most important thing in his life. And she was popular and she was successful, and he probably felt a bit jealous of that.
Was Tony McCluskey bully enough to have been his sister's killer? It was fair to say they had their ups and downs.
It seems that from a very young age, he was bullying Gemma, pushing her around, he was hitting her, he was being generally really quite horrible to her. He was 6 years older, so, you know, big brother, probably had quite a lot of control over her anyway, but it wasn't a good relationship, it wasn't a nice relationship that they had together, and that didn't get any better as they got older.
Despite that fact, affording a place of their own was made easier by a decision to buy a place together.
They didn't always fall out, but they lived together. It was a small house, small maisonette off the Hackney Road in the East End of London. Gemma was a feisty individual. She had had success in her life. She was very well liked by her family and friends. She had lots of friends, and that was different to Tony. Tony had very few friends.
And when the pair clashed in public, mostly written off as just Gemma and Tony at it again.
Some of the things will get witnessed and can be interpreted as sibling rivalry or brother and sister fighting, or maybe even people would look at it and think, well, he's a bit of a bully, actually. But they wouldn't necessarily be that concerned.
Outside of the family, Gemma would cover for her brother.
The thing about domestic abuse is that most of it is hidden. It's inside the family home, and perhaps between a brother and a sister, they're not going to talk about it to other people.
What would make Tony combustible enough to snap and kill his sister? Few knew of the one specific cause of a growing relationship tension: drugs. Tony was hooked on skunk.
Skunk is a form of cannabis. It's a strain of cannabis. It's been created by breeding cannabis plants to get particularly high levels of the active ingredient in cannabis, THC.
His life really revolved around work, when we could get himself to work, and the fact that he was using skunk as regularly as he did.
Gemma was known to argue with her brother about his skunk use. He didn't like that.
His devotion to the drug caused significant and aggressive changes to Tony McCluskey's behaviour.
So when you smoke it, those usual feelings when you smoke cannabis come on faster, and they come on much stronger. Now, if somebody is susceptible to mental illness, it might exacerbate their symptoms. But it can also trigger kind of psychotic-like symptoms in healthy people who smoke a lot of it as well. So they might start to see things that aren't really there, they're hallucinating. They might start to have delusions where they believe something that isn't really true. It can make them paranoid.
Living with that behaviour was probably not what Gemma expected from her brother. The pair often argued.
There was a difference between the two of them, and of course, you know, him and his life around skunk and the violent interaction and the arguments.
As Tony would use drugs, so he would become violent, turn on his sister. Investigators discover that there were rows between the couple, sometimes over household disputes. And always over Tony's use of skunk. He would fly off the handle.
He would react almost immediately to a situation which perhaps many others wouldn't have done. Is perhaps a story as to why this happened.
Police did not attach significance to it, but as Tony McCluskey had leafleted to try to find the missing Gemma, he was sporting a bandaged hand. A taxi driver would later say a man, sporting a similarly bandaged hand, got into his cab after loading a heavy case into the taxi's boot. Detective Nicholson had uncovered enough to suggest that impulsive, violent behaviour was a very real possibility when dealing with Tony McCluskey. But a key turning point in confirming who was her killer was still to emerge. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery of the suitcase in the canal, there was no doubt who was pushing the campaign to find his sister, Tony McCluskey. But as police began to investigate events, further anomalies appeared in his story. 3 days into the search, Tony visits his and Gemma's mum, who was in hospital.
He sends a text message saying, kind of, "Mum's doing fine, I hope you're okay, and love you." And he sends a couple of kisses. And of course, during the investigation, we had a look at all the call data and text messaging between the two of them, and that was the only time he ever said that he loved her, and the only time he ever put kisses on the text message.
He's portraying himself in this text message as a loving brother. That doesn't fit with what other people know about his relationship. That's a glaring inconsistency. He's never said before, "I love you." And if you look at that one text message in isolation, you'd go, "Oh, caring brother." If you look at the other text messages that he's sent over the weeks and months, that is unusual.
Texting the words "love ya" was very much out of character for Tony McCluskey. More inconsistencies emerged.
When he came back from the hospital, he came back and he spoke to Gemma's friends, and he said that his mum had said to him that Gemma had been up there earlier on that day, which clearly wasn't true. And one of the friends that he reported that to said, "Are you absolutely certain about that?" And got Tony to ring the hospital to clarify if that was the case. And of course, he came back off the telephone, the charade of going through that with the telephone, with the hospital itself, and said, "No, I've made a mistake there." But he was trying to lay, say traps. He was trying to cover his tracks along the way.
On March 7th, now a murder inquiry, police asked McCluskey in for an interview.
When the police re-interviewed him, because he would now be a significant witness, and the police would be trying to find out who was the last person to see Gemma alive. And because he lived with her, he was quite potentially going to be the person with that information. And they would have been forensically listening to absolutely everything he said. And when there are inconsistencies in his story, then that is going to raise red flags for investigators.
The previously talkative Tony McCluskey suddenly changed his tone.
When we spoke to him, he gave a no-comment interview.
So they start to ask him more questions, and as those questions become more and more interrogative, and he starts to be treated more as a suspect rather than just a concerned brother, he starts to become very defensive. Police ask him questions, he says no comment.
Which is a very strange behaviour for somebody who really wants to find who hurt their sister. Tony seems to be just responding to events as they happen, dealing with them, not in a state of panic, because he does not seem to be in a state of panic, but dealing with them in the way that he thought it was best dealt with. But things were rapidly escalating out of his control.
They find that he makes a phone call to a taxi company on the night that they think Gemma disappears. So they go to the taxi company and they find the driver who took him, and he reports that McCluskey turned up in his taxi cab with a large suitcase, which he claimed was a sound system.
The CCTV of him putting the holdall in the boot of the car, they were all really significant pieces of evidence.
The mistakes of Tony McCluskey were helping police close in on the man who had murdered his sister. Police were now combing through hundreds of hours of CCTV footage. When he'd left the flat, McCluskey's every move was monitored by cameras.
I think a big mistake Tony made was not realising the extent of CCTV cameras, especially in a place like London. They're everywhere. They're recording people's footfall, they're recording traffic movements. You have them outside nightclubs. People, some of these cameras are installed by the police, some of them are installed by local authorities, but increasingly you have private businesses and you have private individuals even installing CCTV cameras. And the police can turn to all of these sources to get images if they have a suspect that they're trying to piece together what they've been up to.
It was inevitable. Tony McCluskey would be caught on camera.
He took Gemma's torso in the suitcase and took the suitcase to the local minicab firm. We also know from his call data that he moved around the area that evening, and we also know from CCTV that he made at least 2 trips from the address. So it's conceivable that he had 2 or possibly 3 journeys, one in the minicab with the torso, and perhaps in the other bags, perhaps on foot that evening.
McCluskey didn't realise it, but his desperate attempts to conceal the murder were falling into an all too predictable pattern for investigators to discover.
So this was a classic case of dismemberment for the purposes of transportation. The body was in 6 parts, head, torso not cut, because if you cut across the torso, that makes a tremendous amount of mess. So the torso is intact, and the upper limbs, 2 upper limbs, and the 2 lower limbs. The heaviest part, of course, then is the torso. And if you have a large enough suitcase with wheels, and of course that was what happened with Gemma, nobody thinks twice about somebody walking along a pavement carrying a heavy suitcase. And so the trunk is often the most difficult part of the body to dispose of.
Having reported his sister missing and led a leaflet campaign to find her, Tony McCluskey was coming into focus as a suspect in the murder of Gemma McCluskey. He was simply unaware of what evidence he had left behind.
I think people believe they are more forensically aware than they actually are, and that's largely to do with television telling them, you know, I did this and this is what happened. They then have a go at it perhaps themselves and find that it is not easy. It is a really difficult thing to do, to dismember a body, both psychologically but actually physically as well.
This is what had happened that night. Gemma would sometimes lock Tony out of the flat and he would return demanding to be let in. On the night of March the 1st, matters were brought to a head between them because of a flooded bathroom. Barely conscious, probably because of drug use, Tony had left a tap on.
They had an argument over a small flood in the flat that was his fault. And it was the last straw for Gemma, and she had told her friends that she just couldn't take it anymore and she was going to ask him to leave. And it was on the day that she went missing, in fact, that she'd gone back to the flat to tell him that.
Gemma had been out collecting a takeaway. Her brother likely to be doing what Tony McCluskey did, getting wasted on skunk.
With skunk, you know, there's paranoia, there's delusions where they're starting to believe things that aren't really real. You can see how, you know, like a little argument could blow up into something much bigger.
Tony was a person who had no problem resolving his issues through violence, and that had been established throughout his life, especially with the way that he interacted with Gemma. And when he had this major argument with her, he responded with violence.
Violence which would lead to a suitcase of body parts being thrown into a canal later that evening. Left with his dead sister before him, Tony McCluskey decided to throw his sister's body where he felt it might not be found. The nearest water to Pelter Street is a fraction over a mile at Regent's Canal. Too far to walk with a body. But how to remove Gemma without being detected? It is in this moment of the evening's timeline that Tony decides to chop up his sister's body.
Tony did not think things through after he had killed Gemma. One of his biggest mistakes was to try or to think that he could dispose of and hide her body. He thought that that would probably be the easiest thing. It turned out for him that that was his undoing, and that was the most difficult thing that he could have done.
Tony knows there is nowhere to hide Gemma in his small flat. More clues as to the killer's identity would come in what he did next, because he did not know how to do it. The method of dismemberment becomes apparent. All very amateur.
Initially, Tony uses a knife, and that's not successful.
He then turned her body over, tried again, and it still wouldn't cut through. He then found a much bigger blade, probably a meat cleaver.
It takes a lot of work to cut a body up into lots of different pieces.
Tony McCluskey knows he'll need transport. he doesn't own a car.
The reason Tony had called for a minicab to take the torso away is because what could he do? He didn't have a driving licence. He'd never ever driven a car before. He'd never been shown how to drive a car before. He's killed his sister. How is he going to get rid of her body or her torso? And I'm guessing that's what went through his mind, and he thought, right, okay, there's a local minicab firm.
A huge mistake for a killer to make.
He takes Gemma's torso, as we know, and he throws it into the canal less than a mile away from his house. What we do know is that when it came to a post-mortem, Gemma's torso was only weighed 5 stone, but that in itself, if you're carrying 5 stone on your own a mile across East London, that was very, very difficult, and the risk involved. So we're guessing that that's why he made the decision to, call a minicab firm.
By identifying the cab, detectives were able to track it down and check in the boot for evidence which might yield DNA. A spot of blood had leaked from the bag in which Tony had placed his sister's body parts.
Once they've found traces of blood, they can then take a swab of that blood, isolate some cells and extract the DNA and try and find out if that blood matches the DNA from the person they're trying to identify, in this case, Gemma.
The blood source DNA did match Gemma's. A search of the flat yielded yet more. As predicted by Sue Black, he'd cut up her body in the bathroom where microscopic fragments of her body were found. The case against Tony McCluskey was complete.
The blood in the boot of the car, the body matter that is found in the bathroom were clearly significant. The CCTV of him putting the holdall in the boot of the car, they were all really significant pieces of evidence that helped convict him.
McCluskey claimed that he had blanked out when he appeared in court on a charge of murder of his sister. If the jury had believed him, the charge might well have been downgraded to manslaughter, which he was prepared to admit.
It's possible that he was in some kind of skunk-induced delusion, but then it seems unlikely that he wouldn't remember anything. I mean, it takes a lot of work to cut a body up into lots of different pieces, pack them into a suitcase, take the suitcase out, dispose of the body, come back to your flat and then clean the body. That's not something you can do in 5 minutes. That takes a lot of work, and it seems unlikely that he wouldn't be able to remember any of that. So he's continuing to lie, either to himself, to other people, to this day, and he's never expressed any remorse.
The jury rejected his claim. 10 months after killing her, dismembering her body, dragging it through the streets and casting it into the canal, Tony McCluskey was found guilty of Gemma McCluskey's murder and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 20 years.
It's aggravated homicide, so that means that it carries a greater prison sentence. There is the psychology of what he did to his own sister that his family have to now deal with. So that was a huge burden that he placed on his family in terms of the desecration of the body of his sister. And that, I think, is where the most challenging thing is for family and for friends and relatives of somebody. Not only have they lost them because they've been murdered, but they've also been dismembered over above that. And the very fact that he was her brother just compounds the difficulty.
Gemma McCluskey had achieved what so many young actors aspire to, a role on a prime-time TV soap. She was a success. Her brother was not. The part-time window cleaner was a skunk adult junkie whose violent moods were taken out on his sister with whom he lived. He had made lots of mistakes in his lifestyle choices and after the worst thing he'd done in his troubled life. Ironically, the immediate aftermath of Gemma's life was captured on camera, her brother's mistakes filmed for all to see. And his chosen method of hiding the truth was one which provided a body of evidence, his brutal cuts on Gemma's body betraying his panic, inexperience, even the room that he had done his grisly work, and the type of flat that he lived in. A killer's mistakes revealed on a body which sent messages to an expert who knew how to read them.
Good night, God bless, Gemma. We all miss you and love you. Thank you.